previous movie, we looked at a few scenarios where we could link in large CAD files into our project and briefly talked about some of the pros and cons, but I'd like to dig in a little deeper right now. What I have here on screen is a file that has a very large CAD file linked into it, and it's almost impossible to actually see it because way over here at the origin, there's just a small circle, and then over here, what appears to be like a gray dot. But when I hover over that, you'll notice the bounding box for the CAD file. And all that white space in between is actually the distance between what's actually a site plan over here on the right and just a small marker that I placed at the origin over there on the left. So I'm going to do zoom in window a couple times over on this site plan to actually illustrate that that is in fact an entire site plan. And I'm going to zoom in here on the left-hand side near this cul-de-sac here and do a spot coordinate on this first house. So let's get in close enough that we can actually do a coordinate right there. And I'll go to annotate, spot coordinate, pick a point right here and place it there, cancel out of the command, and zoom in to take a look at those numbers. And you can see that the numbers are about 92,000 by 102,000. Now, if I switch over to AutoCAD and look at the same file, and I've kind of zoomed in here on the same area, as you can see, and I'll do AutoCAD's ID command, ID, enter, and click right at the endpoint of that same house. Notice that you see the same numbers, 102 by 92,000. So the only real advantage that we get from using the larger file that has the dummy object at the origin is that the coordinates that you query in both files are identical. So you're working with the same coordinate system sort of by default there. But that's a lot of trouble to go through to make that happen. And we have other alternatives available to us in Revit. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select this file. I'm going to unpin it and I'm going to remove it. Then I'll do a zoom to fit to zoom back in on the origin of the file. Now you'll notice here that in the center of the file, I have the project base point, and if I tab, the survey point, and they're both turned on, and they're in their default locations of 0, 0, 0. And Revit's origin there in the center of the screen. So let's go to Insert and Link CAD, and I'm going to link the original version of the file. Now, I mentioned in the previous movie that this is the sample file that comes with AutoCAD. If you have a copy of AutoCAD, you have this file, but I've provided it right here. The import units for this file work best if you set that to feet. And if you choose origin to origin, you're going to get center to center anyway. But I'll go ahead and stick with origin to origin. And it will recognize that the file's too big, so it'll use center to center, and it'll drop it right there in the center of the screen. Now, if I roll my wheel to back up a little bit, you will see that as I move away from the center, here are those houses over here on the left-hand side. And I'm going to zoom in on that same house that we were querying a few moments ago, and I'm going to add a spot coordinate again. From here to there, zoom in. And as you can see, the numbers don't match. So what can we do about it? Well, there are actually a few solutions, and I'll look at one solution here in this movie, and then we'll look at another alternative in the next movie. But the solution that I'm going to look at right here is actually quite simple. All we have to do is use the Acquire Coordinates command. Now, if we go to the Manage tab, under Coordinates, we have Acquire and Publish. Now, where we've seen these previously is in the last chapter, we did a couple movies on saving shared coordinates. And you may recall there was a dialog box there that had these two choices, acquire and publish. And we talked about when you would choose one over the other, but essentially it's just the direction that these shared coordinates are going to go. So if you want the current file to own the coordinates and you want to share those coordinates with your links, then you do publish. If you want the current file to gain the coordinates from the link file, then you use acquire. Now, in the last chapter, we used publish because we were starting in our Revit site plan and we wanted to share those coordinates with our Revit projects that were linked in. This time, we're going to use acquire because we want to pull those coordinates from that linked site plan that we got from our civil engineer. So all I have to do is choose acquire, click anywhere on the linked CAD file, and watch this symbol right here, particularly the coordinate values when I do. That's it. We're done. All we had to do was acquire the coordinates, and Revit takes care of the rest. So the CAD file is now reporting its actual coordinates, 92,000 by 102,000, and we're seeing that displayed right here. Furthermore, if I select the CAD file, you'll notice that under shared site, it's now got a name called default location. So shared coordinates are set up. We've pulled them right from the CAD file and we did it all in a single step. So it's a very easy way to take care of not only setting up shared coordinates, but also making sure that all the coordinate entries match the nested CAD file and doing so without having to have this file miles and miles away from our origin. Because if I zoom out here, you can see that our origin marker is still right where it was and our elevations are still right where they are. And I've got a much more reasonable view on screen. Now I do want to point out one or two final points here. Notice that I only see the project base point here now, back at the origin. And if I click on it, its coordinates are very similar to the ones of the spot coordinate because it's not all that far away. You know, you can see another 92,000 by 102,000, just slightly different numbers. So that's the location of this point, and it's similar to the location of that point. Now, if I do ZF to zoom to fit, you're actually going to see the survey point has jumped way far away, many miles away from the project base point over here. So we're back to kind of where we started at the beginning of the movie. Well, if I click here, the reason for that is this is at 0, 0. Now you may recall when we talked about the survey point in previous movies that it can be either clipped or unclipped, as can the project base point. And the reason that this survey point is where it is because it's clipped to the origin. And the origin is now, several miles away off to the left. If you wanted to, you have two remedies here. You could unclip the survey point and drag it back to the site plan and snap it to some benchmark in the site plan. With it unclipped, it would report the coordinates of that new location, and then you could keep it displayed on screen. The other alternative is to simply go back to VG and turn it off. Now, since I've already shown you how to unclip it and move it in previous movies, in this case, I'm simply going to turn it off, click OK, and then do zoom to fit again to get back in on my site plan. So using the acquire coordinates command is actually a very quick and easy way to set up shared coordinates with a linked CAD file. It gives you the flexibility of being able to move the large file to a location that's convenient within the project, and then simply acquire the coordinates directly out of that file, which will set up the shared coordinates for you. And another really nice side benefit of that is that once you've got shared coordinates between AutoCAD and Revit, you're going to benefit from all the same benefits that you would get with shared coordinates between Revit and Revit. And that means that if you export DWG files from your Revit project and send them to your civil engineer, they will be able to insert those files into exactly the correct location because those files will export out using the shared coordinate system. I'd like to look at one more scenario with linking your CAD files in and using shared coordinates with those files. Just like we saw in the previous few movies here, when you select the CAD file, it's either going to come in at the origin if it's within that 20-mile radius that Revit requires, or it's going to just use center to center. And this one is no different. This is just that linked site plan. And I want to point out that currently its shared site is set to not shared. So it currently does not have a shared coordinate system. It's just sort of centered on screen there. Now, because I tried to use origin, Revit actually pinned the site plan for me. So what I'm going to do here is an alternative to what we did in the last movie is I'm actually going to unpin this and move it. Because the one thing that we did not discuss in the previous movie, even though it was very effective to use the acquire coordinates, what we didn't discuss was that by just accepting the center to center location of the CAD file, we still might have to move some of the things around in our project. In other words, if I zoom in here, we were concerned with these houses over here. But you notice here that our elevation markers are still sitting over here in a kind of vacant area of the site. Now, you might have views, floor plans, elevations, sections, and sheets already set up looking at this general location, and yet your work is being done over here in this location. So it actually might be more convenient if all of this geometry were actually more towards the center of the screen. Now, it's quite easy to do that. We just simply need to move the site plan into that location in order to achieve that. So of course, if we do that, that's going to have an impact on the coordinates. So let me just show you how we would go through that process. So I'm going to select the linked CAD file, make sure it's unpinned, and then from zoomed out like this, I'm going to just sort of eyeball the movement first, get it close. Then I'll do a zoom window and zoom in on the area in question. Now, at this point, I can select this CAD file, move it very precisely. You can even rotate it if you need to, and make sure you specify the center of your rotation. And I could snap that to a nice horizontal. And you'll see that this house right here now is right within the middle of all of my elevation markers. And so if that's the focal point of my project, then I've got that exactly where I want it to be. Now, the trouble with that is if I go to annotate and I add my spot coordinate here, then, as we've previously discussed, these numbers are not going to match what I need them to be. Well, another alternative is to simply go to manage here, and under coordinates, we can say that we want to specify the coordinates at a point. And I'm going to pick right at that location. And we've seen this command in previous movies, but let's go ahead and put in the values that we want here. Now, for now, I'm just going to put in the east, west, and the north, south, but I put in 102,497.8 and 92,204.3. You could also put in the elevation, and it's probably close to 85 or 86 based on these numbers that we see here in the background. But for now, I'll leave it set to 0. And when I click OK, you're going to see that symbol update. Well, if you select the CAD file, we've now established the coordinates, but notice that the shared site is still set to not shared. So, you certainly could do the acquire option that we talked about in the previous movie, but if you'd actually rather use your coordinates here in your Revit project, you can still publish to the linked CAD file. And so if I click the not shared button, instead of acquire, I can choose the publish option, click reconcile, and now I have still created that default location. But this time when I click save, just like we saw with the Revit project, it will actually ask me if it's okay to save the CAD file. So I'll click save. Now what's interesting is Revit's actually saving to a DWG file, saving to a CAD file. So let's see what that looks like in CAD. Now we don't really see any difference in the CAD file. But what's actually happened is if you go to the user coordinate system command, UCS enter, and then you question mark and press enter, it allows you to get a list of all the user coordinate systems that are saved in this file. Notice that there is now a UCS called Revit default location. So the way that the shared coordinate system will record the coordinates that you've saved or published to the CAD file is it will store them in a user coordinate system in the CAD file. And then, of course, the recipient of the CAD file will have to make that the current coordinate system if they want to use those coordinates. But of course, they're not required to. They can stick with the world coordinate system and continue with their own coordinates. So it's a kind of a way of reconciling the two. So that's how you could actually choose to publish to a CAD file as opposed to acquiring. Now, I think in most cases, if you're working with a civil file from AutoCAD, it's probably easier to actually use the acquire method that we talked about in the previous movie. But this just gives you an alternative way to do it if project needs dictate. In this movie, we're going to look at what happens when you export geometry out of Revit into CAD formats. I'm going to look specifically at creating a DWG file from our Revit project, but I'll also talk briefly about what happens if you go to another Autodesk product called Navisworks. So I'm in a file that has a level 1 floor plan set up, and what I've done is I've kind of set up everything that we've already talked about. So let me just sort of review what's here. First of all, we've got the CAD link loaded in. And if I select it here, you can see that it's already got shared coordinates and it's shared with the main default location. I used the acquire coordinates command, but before I did that, I actually positioned the file in the middle of the screen. And you can see the 4 elevation markers here that the project started with. And I kind of centered in on that one house that we've been talking about in the last several movies. Then if I zoom in a little closer on that house, you can see that it is reporting the coordinates from the CAD file because I did the acquire coordinates. And what I've done is I've traced over it using some basic Revit geometry. So I've just got an outline of walls, and then I also put a roof on that object as well. Now, the last 2 things I did was I moved the project base point to the lower left corner of the building. And if you click it, you can see it's reporting the coordinates at that location. And then if I zoom out just a little bit, I also moved the survey point to this stub location right here that was in the CAD file. I just sort of snapped it to that. And before I moved it, I made sure it was unclipped so that I could move it and it would report those coordinates without inadvertently changing the origin. So the 00 point is still off the screen to the far left, several miles away, in fact. And we are just focused in on this small area. So the final thing that I did was I turned on the crop region of this floor plan and I cropped the view down so that it's a little bit easier to focus in on the area that we're interested in. So let's say that all this work has been done and we've synchronized all the coordinates now. And so we're using the coordinates from the linked CAD file and everything's working nicely. And we've now decided to take what we've created, this small building here, and send it back out to the owner of the DWG. So it's fairly easy to do that. Revit is able to export into other CAD formats, and you do that on your application menu. So if I go to the big R menu here, and I go down to export, come over here in CAD formats, you can see that I can export to DWG, DXF, DGN, and ASYS set files. So I'm going to do DWG, one of the more common ones, of course. It'll default to exporting just the current view, and you do have some other options here if you prefer to export more than the current view, but for this example, the current view will work perfectly fine. Now, in a few moments, I'm going to show you the export setup features, but for the time being here, what I'm going to do is actually just export using the default settings. So I'll simply click Next here. That will take me to a dialog that will ask me where I want to save the file, and I'm just going to save it loose in my exercise files folder. I'm going to accept the default name and the default file format, and I'll simply click OK. Now, there's a couple things I'm going to want to point out in the resulting DWG file. The export that we just created is going to be unsatisfactory in two areas. So let's go here to AutoCAD, and I'm going to actually open the file that we just created. So it was this one here called Shared Export Floor Plan Level 1. I'll click Open, and it doesn't appear that anything is here on screen. So first, let me do Zoom Extents. And then notice that if I zoom out a little bit, there's a small dot right there. And somewhere else on screen, might have to zoom, there it is. There's another small dot there. So there's two objects that are rather far apart. Well, let me just sort of zoom in on one of these and figure out what that is. And that's our actual building. Okay, so this is the line work that was generated from our Revit geometry. And it just sort of traced over the walls and gave us these green lines, and then these red lines are the edges of the roof, and it even exported the annotation there. But what about that other item that we saw over here somewhere? Let me see if I can find it. There it is right there, okay? So I'll sort of zoom in on that location there. And what this is actually an X clip boundary. So if I select it and I go to properties, you can see that that's actually the external reference, and this is the X clip boundary around there. So what I did that I really shouldn't do is I exported from the view that already included the DWG file, the linked DWG file. And so Revit actually exported that DWG file again. And if I were to actually remove this X-clip boundary, you would see that the entire site plan has been exported, but it really didn't do a very good job of it. So here I'll remove clipping, and there it is, right? And you see how it's sitting over here. But of course, it's not in the correct location, and it wasn't even clipped in the proper area. Well, we could troubleshoot why that is, but the good news is you don't really need to export the site plan again because your recipient already has that file. In fact, you've linked in their file, so there's really no reason to give them another copy of their own file. So I'm going to close this file without saving it. And here I am in that original file. And all I really want to export to them is just my stuff, just the things that I created. So if I switch back over to Revit, what I want to do is turn off this DWG file. Now, I've already done that here in a copy of this floor plan that I just called level 1, no DWG, and I just selected the DWG and hit it. So now I'm going to return to the export command, go to CAD formats, and choose DWG. You can see it's obviously a little bit simpler. And again, I'll accept the defaults, click Next. This time it's going to use the name no DWG, so I'll just go ahead and accept that. And what I'm going to do instead this time, instead of opening the file, is I'm actually going to just insert it. So I'm going to do I for insert, then I'll click browse, and I'll select that file that I just created and open it up. Now I want to uncheck, sometimes this is checked, so I want to uncheck here where it says insertion point and insert it at 000, because ultimately what we want is to be able to insert it at 00 and have it come in exactly the correct location. So let's see if that's actually working for us and click OK. Now if I do zoom and then extends, what you're going to see is that file that I just exported actually ended up right here at the origin. And it ended up at the origin in kind of a strange orientation. Notice that it's using the upper left-hand corner, not the lower left-hand corner, not the upper right-hand corner. And why I would expect it to be one of those is, well, here at the lower left-hand corner is where I have my project base point. And then back here in the other floor plan, I've been annotating this corner. So it didn't favor either of those locations. It favored this one instead. Now, what it turns out, if I zoom out here, I can kind of give you a clue as to why that is. And actually, I'll do that here in the cleaner version. If you imagine where the center is between these two sets of elevations, it's right about there. And if you've ever started a Revit project from scratch, and certainly if you've gone through the lessons in this course, you've seen that the origin of the Revit project typically starts right there in the center of the screen. That origin is actually still there, and it's something that Revit calls project internal. So what I'm going to do is create a spot coordinate right at that location and show you a feature of spot coordinates that we have not yet talked about. This is the coordinates that it's reading right at that location, but if I select the symbol and edit its type, what you'll see down here, if I scroll down, is that there are some options for the coordinate origin. And if I open the list, there's actually 3 choices. So we could measure from the survey point, which is essentially saying measure from the shared coordinates. That's what we're seeing right now. If we measure from the project base point and click OK, now you can see project base point is here, and it's about 4 units this way and about 34 units that way. So you can see that that's pretty much correct. Okay, so now it's measuring from this, point as the origin. But there's a third choice, and exactly what is that? Well, if I change this to relative and I click OK, now it's basically 00, right? Actually, the 00 is at the edge of the roof instead of the edge of the building. So you can see that I'm 1 unit and 1 unit away. So the origin is actually right about here where my mouse is. And you can see now that the coordinate is actually measuring from that instead. So it turns out that there's really 3 locations that Revit can use as that basis point. However, when you export, it can only export to 2 of those. So the 2 that it can export to is either this one, the original internal origin, which is always there, what they're calling relative for the coordinate, but it's actually the internal origin, or the shared coordinate system, which was that first option down here. So we can choose, they call it relative here, but that's the internal origin. They call it survey point here. That's the shared coordinates. We can't export to project base point. So that's not an option under exporting. So just how do we choose the option we want? Let's go back to the big R. Let's go to export, choose CAD formats, DWG, and let's click the small little browse button here to change the export setup settings. Under units and coordinates, you can see the coordinate system basis is either project internal, that's what we just saw was named relative, or shared. That's what we saw was named survey point. You pretty much always want to use shared, because shared is what you've gone to all the trouble of setting up throughout all the various lessons in this course. And so that's probably the coordinate system that's important to you and your project team. So we're going to choose shared here, click OK, I'll click next. I'll just add a number 2 at the end of this name here so that it doesn't overwrite the existing one. And then I'll switch back to AutoCAD one more time, do an insert, select that file, open it, 00, click OK, and then let me zoom extents, zoom back in over here. And if we find that cul-de-sac nearby, oh, sorry, that's not the right location. It's actually a little bit further up. Here it is right here. There's our cul-de-sac, and you can kind of see those green lines. Here is the file that we just exported from Revit. And notice that not only is it here inserted as a block now in the file, but it's actually in exactly the correct location. So when you export to shared, it's going to drop correctly in the proper location because both files understand that shared coordinate system. So this is a really important point to emphasize whenever you do have to export files. And that's true not just for exporting DWG, that's also true if you're going to export to Navisworks as well. So I'm not going to go through the whole process of exporting to Navisworks, but if you have a copy of Navisworks on your system, then on the Add-ins tab in Revit, it will have installed a Navisworks plugin here under External Tools. So if I choose Navisworks from that plugin and then click here where it says Navisworks Settings, you're going to see a Revit option here. And if you look right here, you'll see one of the options is coordinates, and you'll have those same two choices, project internal or shared. So always make sure that it's set to shared before you export to Navisworks recipients. Otherwise, when they try and insert the files, they're going to always go in the wrong location and they're going to have to move them around. So whether it's going to AutoCAD or Navisworks or any other program, you always want to export that shared coordinate system to get the proper results.